It was 2013 when the announcement came. HBO, Tom Hanks, and Steven Spielberg were to produce a third World War II miniseries, and this one would take us into the skies over Western Europe with the 8th Air Force. However, after several delays, HBO let the project go in 2019 due to high production costs. Luckily for us, Apple TV came to the rescue and greenlit Masters of the Air in 2020, with principal photography beginning in 2021. Most, if not all, filming took place in England, with much of it in Abingdon, where the 100th Bomb Group's air base, Thorpe Abbotts, was reconstructed. While an official number wasn't found at the time of this recording, the budget is estimated to be somewhere between $250 to $300 million for the 9-part miniseries. In short, there is pretty much every reason to believe that this is probably the most expensive show ever made, which, given its Hank Spielberg brain trust, makes sense. Band of Brothers and the Pacific were the most expensive shows ever produced at their respective release times. Band of Brothers being released in 2001 with a budget of around $125 million, and the Pacific being released in 2010 with a budget somewhere between $200 to $217 million depending on your source. And in both shows, you can see every dollar of it. There is no doubt that Masters of the Air will also be of high production quality like its two older brothers. This is to be expected, but what else can we expect in this high-flying drama of epic air battles and stories of those pilots and crews who brought the war to Hitler's doorstep? In Band of Brothers, we followed Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne, as they trained together at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, parachuted into Normandy and the Netherlands, fought off a German counterattack in Belgium, and made their way to Hitler's Eagle's Nest in the spring of 1945. The names of Winters, Garnier, Toy, Spears, and Nixon became household names. The series is a pop culture icon and carried the torch passed from Saving Private Ryan for developing interests of the Second World War to a whole new generation. 9 years later, after Band of Brothers blew away everybody's minds, a companion series called The Pacific was released. This time viewers were confronted with the struggles fought between the American and Japanese forces on various islands in the Pacific Theater, bringing to light the stories of John Basilone, Robert Leckie, and Eugene Sledge. While The Pacific may not have struck as much of a chord with most viewers as Band of Brothers did, the miniseries is still an excellent watch, and an important one. It is a brutal and unflinching reminder of how different experiences were between those who fought in the Pacific and those who fought in Europe. While Band of Brothers is the pop culture icon, the Pacific still has plenty of legs to stand on, and it has a lot to say about war. So here we are, 14 years after the Pacific's release, is the next, and likely, final World War II miniseries of the Hank Spielberg team, Masters of the Air. It will bring viewers to a battlefield 6 miles above Earth, following two of the most recognized combat air units of the war, the 100th Bomb Group and the 332nd Fighter Group. In just a matter of days, we will learn about the likes of Gail Clevin, John Egan, Harry Crosby, Rosie Rosenthal, Robert Daniels, Alexander Jefferson, John Kidd, Frank Murphy, John Brady, and many more. Masters of the Air is being released at a critical point for the living memory of World War II. In the United States, we are at an estimated 120,000 surviving World War II veterans. This is out of 16 million who served in uniform, not including all the defense workers who were the backbone of this country's industrial might. While it will be difficult and very improbable to reach the level of Band of Brothers' impact, let's hope that it will breathe a fresh bit of air back into the interests of the Second World War, especially knowing that the further we get away from that time, the greater chance we have of forgetting about it. Like many topics of the Second World War, the air war over Western Europe is a bottomless pit of discussion. One might say you could make a podcast about it. On today's episode, we're talking about what you can expect to see in Masters of the Air. And I'll say it now, there is a lot. So much so that we're going to hit some of the highlights and help you brace for how big of a story this is going to be. We're talking all things Masters of the Air, coming January 26th on Apple TV. Hitler may have called it Fortress Europe, but he sure as hell forgot to put a roof on it. Joined today by my co-host Sam Allen. My name is Mitchell Babarovich, and this is the Air War Podcast. All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Air War Podcast presented by Pursuit Picks Media. And a quick bit of housekeeping before we get into this episode. Please check us out on YouTube at Pursuit Picks Media or on Spotify by searching the Air War Podcast or Pursuit Picks Media. And again, we strive to be a mix of entertaining and informative on this podcast. So if we've missed something, please leave us a comment or send us an email to pursuitpicks@gmail.com. Again, that is pursuitpicks@gmail.com. With the reference material today, the vast majority of it will be coming from Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys, who fought the air war against Nazi Germany by Donald L. Miller. And naturally, that will be the main resource today since we are talking about Masters of the Air, the miniseries, which at the time of this recording will be out in 5 or 6 days. So it's going to be pretty damn exciting. And Sam and I just want to talk about what we're going to be expecting in the series and kind of just go over the timeline of, well, when we expect the first episode, which will probably be in the spring of 1943. And we're going to talk a little bit about the events in World War II that led up to this point in time where they will, in all likelihood, start in the miniseries. But I had to bring in Sam for this. It was really important because some of what we're going to be talking about was prior to America's entry into World War II. And as an American, I don't know about any of that. And so I'm going to make Sam talk a little bit about the Battle of Britain because it's important in the context of without England, there's no way in hell that the air war over Western Europe would have been a victory by the Allies. So we got to start somewhere. So I'm going to let Sam take it away a little bit. He'll talk about the Battle of Britain, what happened after the Battle of Britain, bomber commands, ideas on how to conduct aerial warfare.
Disasters.
Yeah, right. And so there's a lot to unpack in a short amount of time, and we'll try and hit as much as we can. So Sam, just go ahead and tell us about, being a Brit. This is the air war is a big deal because
oh yes,
you guys were our island aircraft carrier, and we very much appreciated that. But let's talk about the air war prior to America's entry into the Second World War.
So obviously, bearing in mind we have a very short time span to fit 2 years of the air war in before the Americans decided to pull the finger out. So, being very brief, so in the summer and autumn of 1940, Britain is not in a very good situation. Been thrown out of France. France has been knocked out of the war. So has every mainland European ally we have. And Hitler, obviously, he thinks he's won, but he hasn't because England's still holding on. So he knows he knows deep down in his heart that a seaborne invasion of the United Kingdom just doesn't work. So they have to find another way out, which is where Hermann Goering and his Luftwaffe come along, and Goering goes to Hitler and persuades him to allow the Luftwaffe to one, try and clear the skies of the RAF, specifically Fighter Command, so that if a seaborne invasion does happen, at least it has a more decent chance of succeeding. And also perhaps the chances of bombing England into submission, basically. And it just does not pan out. After 3 months of constant aerial combat and the Luftwaffe just cannot knock fighter command out of the battle at all. They can't even push them away from their southern airfields, which was the main intention. So that comes to the end of the Battle of Britain, where it's clear that the Germans have lost, but the RAF hasn't won either. It's not quite a stalemate, but it's not far off. While this is happening, RAF Bomber Command, who are the RAF's organization for handling all bomber operations in Europe, and they're deciding that it's now time to start taking the fight to Germany directly. But it's the people they have in command, Bomber Command, the CNC, they're not the sort of people you want in this sort of operation. So what is needed is basically bloodthirsty and ruthless. It has to be surgical almost in respect to a bomber campaign. Well, when Bomber Command starts its major operations against Germany, there's a chap called Sir Richard Pearce in command, and he just hasn't got the drive, he hasn't got the charisma. Basically, he's just a complete disaster. He's sending RAF Bomber Command raids over in penny packets, 30, 40 aircraft at a time. It's nothing that's going to punch a dent into Germany's industry and into its morale.
So, quick question on that. Are these daylight raids or are these nighttime raids yet?
They started off as daylight raids before the Battle of Britain and during, but then they very quickly realized, because of the ranges that are being covered and because of the strength of Germany's fighter strength, they quickly moved to night bombing operations, just because it's the only way to get close to the target without being intercepted. But at this point, you've also got aircraft that aren't really up to the job. The Whitley is a mediocre bomber. It is a long range bomber, and it does have a decent payload, but it has engine troubles and it's just not a very reliable aircraft. And the Vickers Wellington, again, it's a much smaller aircraft, doesn't have the same payload, and the aircraft just aren't up to them.
Are those twin engine?
Yeah, both twin engine bombers. And so they just don't have the ability to do the sort of damage that needs to be. So in the end of 1941, the British cabinet has a report done called the Butt Report. No jokes. And it basically says RAF bombers are not getting within about 20% of RAF bombers are getting within 5 miles of the target, and an even smaller fraction of that is the officer of the ordnance. It's just not going anywhere near the target. And they also realized that Sir Richard Pearce, CNC and Bomber Command, just isn't up to the job. So they look for someone new, and they find this new person in command of one of the bomber groups, Sir Arthur Harris, probably known more infamously to history as Bomber Harris. He is a much more dynamic character. He's one of these people during the interwar years who has developed the theory of bombing and trained his number 5 bomber group to a very high standard. And this is what bomber commands need at this point. It needs the training, it needs the leadership. And so that in February of 1942, Harris is made CNC Bomber Command. And I think this is where a quote of his is a perfect place in the lead up to Masters of the Air. He said that Germany entered the war with a childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone and no one was going to bomb them. Well, they've sowed the wind and now they've reaped the whirlwind. And that is probably the best way to lead up to the Masters of the Air, is where the air war takes a turn of destruction and mayhem in terms of the aim to cause it to Germany.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it's kind of important to point out in terms of the timeline. So the Battle of Britain is 3 years before you start to see the 8th Air Force's arrival in England. And just to give
Yes.
people the timeline of the 8th Air Force's first mission to their last mission, there's the July 4th, 1942 raid, which was in twin engine, I believe they were A-20 Havocs. But the
Yes.
first real 8th Air Force combat operation, particularly with the B-17, was August 17th, 1942, and that mission was led by Paul Tibbets. Paul Tibbets being the man who flew Enola Gay and dropped the first atomic bomb on August 6, 1945. So the 8th Air Force's combat chronicle spans from August 42 until April of 1945, where the show will pick up in all likelihood is just before the 100th ships out from the U.S. They basically ferry their own planes from the U.S. to, is it Greenland or Iceland?
Greenland,
Greenland.
Iceland,
Yes,
Scotland.
thank you. And then they get to Thorpe Abbotts in May of 1943. They begin their combat operations on June 25th, 1943, and then wrap up they wrap up combat operations in April of 1945. But there's a pretty good chance that we're going to see the food supply drops to the Netherlands to combat the Dutch famine of the winter of 1944 to 45 after the failure of Market Garden, where the Germans cut off a lot of um, they basically put a blockade on any kind of food that
Yeah.
went to various parts of the Netherlands. So episode 1 kind of has some giveaways um, that you can see in the opening titles, particularly if you pay attention to the cast. Uh, Naturally, they're going to open up with the friendship of Egan and Clevin. So this is John, and I'm gonna go ahead and get this out of the way now. So John, Bucky, Egan, Gale, Buck, Clevin. So you heard it here first. I cleared up any preordained confusion. One guy's
They didn't think
Bucky.
that one through, did they?
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, those guys should have known they were going to make a mini series about them 80 years later. So Egan is played by Callum Turner. He's got that pencil thin mustache. Well, and if you're watching the video version, I'll throw up photos and videos of all these guys to put in context with what we're talking about. So Egan's played by Turner. His nickname was Bucky. He was a squadron commander in the Bloody Hundredth. His best friend was Gale Buck Clevin, who was another squadron commander in the Bloody Hundredth. They went through training together. They were both assigned to the 100th together. They were part of the 100th Originals. So throughout the series, we will follow those two guys and another guy who was part of the Originals was Harry H. Crosby. He's played by Anthony Boyle. And he wrote a book called A Wing and a Prayer. Crosby was a navigator with the 100th. He ended up being such a good navigator that more often than not, he was typically the group leader on navigating missions. He had already flown his 25 combat missions, got a promotion, and then that promotion actually kept him from going home. So his time with the 100th is unique in that he was at Thorpe Abbotts, and that's the base that the 100th is based at. Sorry, I didn't mean to be redundant with base. That's the airfield that the 100th Bomb Group is based at.
In East Anglia.
Yeah, in East Anglia of England, which is also important to point out. That's the farmland area of the UK, where a lot of these bomber bases, particularly American bases, were constructed. But anyway, so Crosby was with the 100th for all 22 months of their combat operations. So he was very unique in the sense of he was there from day one until the end of the war on May 8th, 1945. So that'll take us to our fourth character, which is Robert Rosie Rosenthal. Now, I mentioned earlier that when they posted the opening title sequence, you can see the list of actors, and the actor who plays Rosenthal is not listed among them. So we probably won't get Rosenthal until the second or third episode. Rosenthal is part of the first group of replacement pilots who arrive in August of 1943, I believe. August or September, but it's when the 100th starts obviously taking on losses, and
Yeah.
Rosenthal arrives, and when he gets to the group, he realizes that there's not an extreme lack of discipline, but a lack of discipline. When he first arrived, nobody was there to check him out in a B-17, and then eventually John Egan took him up. They flew formation together, and Egan was so impressed with Rosenthal that he asked him to fly as his wingman. And so Rosenthal is going to become a major character once we get a couple episodes into the series. And Rosenthal will end up flying 52 combat missions with the 100th. Pretty wild. And I talked a little bit, quite a bit actually, about Rosenthal in the first episode of the Air War podcast. So be sure to go check that out if you want to find out more on Rosenthal. Another thing too, folks, is that as the miniseries releases episodes, we will dedicate a podcast episode each one. So next weekend, Sam and I are going to be really busy because we're going to get the first 2 episodes of the series out. Sam, real quick, I'm going to go down the expected missions list that we're going to see in the series before we get to the Tuskegee Airmen. So this is what I think the expected missions that we're going to see in the mini-series of the 100th Flu. So the big one being the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943. And this is Sam mentioned the word disaster earlier in this episode. And that is probably the first major disaster for the 8th Air Force, who lose 60 bombers on this dual strike mission. So the first force goes to I can't remember if it was Schweinfurt or Regensburg first, but the idea was you have a maximum effort where they send up every bomber in the 8th Air Force, 5, 6, 700 bombers, and you have one group bomb Schweinfurt and then another group bomb Regensburg within a certain time period that will draw the Luftwaffe away. It'll split the Luftwaffe up in terms of numbers, so that way you don't have a full-on slaughter. And there's
It's
various.
also it's
Yeah, go
also
ahead,
worth
Sam.
pointing out that this was also one of the major points of contention between the RAF and the US Army Air Force's 8th, is that after this first Schweinfurt raid, Harris was trying desperately to get the 8th to commit to night bombing raids and directed at Berlin, because that was Harris's main aim in the latter part of 43, early part of 44, was going for Berlin and just ripping it to pieces.
Well, that's a good point, and let's take 2 minutes and explain the difference between how the RAF Bomber Command conducted operations and how the 8th Air Force conducted operations. So I'll explain the American side. So the Americans came over to England with the Norden bomb sight. The Norman bomb sight was this analog computer. This is going to be a terrible explanation, but it was a bomb sight that from a very high altitude was precision accurate. Using finger quotes here for those listening on Spotify.
By 1940 standards.
Right, by 1940 standards. And the Norden bomb sight was able to calculate true airspeed, altitude, slip, and then the bomb angle, right? So the bombardier would put in all of this information, and once he got it situated to where he thought the calculations were accurate, they would drop the bombs. And the idea was precision accuracy, and you would minimize civilian casualties. Obviously, if you're familiar with the air war, it didn't quite pan out that way. The Norden bomb sight was still an excellent piece of equipment, but they tested it, and this story gets repeated, throughout various documentaries, but they tested it in the United States in the desert, where the weather typically is clear, but the weather in Western Europe all year round is very cloudy, rainy,
Yes,
and
it's a mixed bag.
right.
You might get a month of sunshine and then everything else is clouds, rain, fog, wind. It's a mess.
Yeah. So paired with our well-armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, we believe that if we flew in tight formation at high altitude in the daytime with these Norden bomb sites, we could therefore conduct high altitude precision bombing operations. That was the American ideology behind aerial warfare. Now he's going to explain to you about how the RAF Bomber Command did it, which is very different.
Yeah, quite simply, it is the complete opposite. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about why the RAF very quickly switched from daylight raids to nighttime raids. Is because just the sheer, at that early point in the war of 1940-41, the German fighter strength was just overwhelming. It couldn't be bypassed during the day, especially not with the aircraft and the tactics at the time, because it was always fairly spread out, not the tight formations that the 8th would use. It was over a much larger area. And they would come in streams to like basically come in not one after the other, but similar sort of thing. When Harris comes in, it changes up a bit. They're starting to use something called G. It was a it used Chain Home, which is the UK based radar stations, and basically using some fancy scientific magic which I don't understand. This machine would ping off Chain Home and it would just guide them towards the cities. That didn't work. And they realized very quickly accurate bombing at night is just not possible. At least not to the good degree of accuracy to be targeting specific factories, specific ball bearing plants, what have you. But also added to this is Arthur Harris's ideas that basically indiscriminate bombing is the way to go. Just saturation bombing of a city, of any entire industrial complex, just bomb it all. Because not only will you probably get those factories, but you'll also get the people who work in those factories. You'll also create a refugee crisis, which creates havoc all over the country. There'll be food shortages, and it's about breaking down the whole state by bombing. And you'll see this in the Thousand Bomber Raids, in Operation Gomorrah against Hamburg, the burning of Hamburg, and then more infamously later in the war against Dresden. It was all about saturation bombing over a large area. Burn a city if you can, that's brilliant. If not, just blow it to buggery. That's the essence of RAF doctrine during the later part of the war.
Yeah, so we just wanted to take a second to explain the difference between how those two air forces work. So we've got the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943. The 100th Bomb Group loses 9 B-17s in that operation. That's also the mission that made Gail Clevin very noteworthy. And you see part of this in the trailer. There's a part where he grabs his co-pilot and he says, "We're going to sit here and take it." I won't go into the details of that, but I won't go into the details of that now, but we will go into it once that episode airs. So that gives Clevin a lot of notoriety. So the next mission that I would think they'd show, and again, there's going to be ones that I don't have on this list, but these are just the ones that I am 99% sure they're going to show. So the next would be the Münster raid. This is October 10th, 1943, an absolutely disastrous one for the 100th. They sent up one squadron with the air division that was sent out to bomb Münster, and the 100th loses 12 of 13 B-17s. This mission gives Rosenthal a lot of notoriety because he was the only B-17 to come home. It's a really great story in Masters of the Air. He wasn't flying his usual B-17, which was called Rosie's Riveters. They were flying Royal Flush. And there's a part in Crosby's book where Crosby, he was on leave or something. He didn't have to fly that day. But he gets to the base and he asks how many were lost today. And he goes, the guy who gives him the information says, all of them except for this new kid named Rosie. And then that was Rosenthal's third mission. His third mission, he goes out and every single plane in his squadron is shot down except for his. Absolutely wild. And then he goes on to fly 49 more combat missions. It's pretty crazy. So then we've got the second Schweinfurt raid, which is only 4 days later. That takes place on October 14th, 1943. It's known as Black Thursday. This is where 60 B-17s are shot down on the mission, and then another 17 are written off, which means they were basically damaged beyond repair. So in total, you have 77 bombers that are lost. I
I
keep
think
saying
it's worth.
B-17s. I should point out I don't always mean B-17s when I put it with these numbers because I know the B-24 was there. I'm sorry. I recognize the B-24. I'm sorry. So I'm trying to say bombers. If I keep saying B-17s, my apologies. So B-17s were flown by the 100th. So that's why I, get them mixed up. Anyways, go on, Sam.
I was just going to say, because obviously here we are, we're talking about the 8th Air Force losses, and it's 60 aircraft, it's 70 aircraft, and it doesn't seem a lot when you say it, especially when you consider, for example, RAF
Good
Bomber
point.
Command is doing 1,000 bomber raids.
Yep.
But firstly, the RAF has 2 years on the 8th.
Yeah.
It has 2 years of experience. It has 2 years of building up that industry. And the 8th at this point is what, 400 aircraft, 500? It hasn't got the strength that it would reach later in the war. These losses are crippling
Yeah, they're very
losses.
critical at this stage. Also important to point out, there's 10 men in each bomber.
Mm,
So I mean, so like on the second Schweinfurt raid, there's 60 B-17s that go down. That's 600 men that are killed, wounded,
yeah.
captured, or
In an
missing.
afternoon.
Yeah, right, in one day. So if you're part of the personnel at one of those airfields in East Anglia, I mean that's absolutely gut wrenching.
Oh yeah.
So far we've got the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 43, Münster October 10th, 1943, second Schweinfurt raid October 14th, 1943. Now I'm moving into 1944. So we've got Operation Argument. This was known as Big Week, and this was a week straight in February of 1944, where bombers were sent up to lure the Luftwaffe into a battle because now the P-51 Mustang, the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang, is starting to outfit units like the 354th Fighter Group, the 357th, the 4th Fighter Group, and now the Americans have a long-range fighter escort that can go with the bombers deeper into Germany. And so the 8th makes it a maximum effort for 1 week straight to get as many Luftwaffe planes up into the air so our pilots can shoot them down. And then a couple weeks later, we have the first American Berlin raid, which is March 6th, 1944. This is an absolutely horrendous mission for the 100th. They lose 15 B-17s on this mission. Just got the running out of time message on. We're good for 40 minutes, by the way, Sam. So we still got some time.
Oh, that's all right.
So followed by that, we've got Operation Overlord D-Day. There's a couple shots in this trailer where you can see the B-17s, the silver or the aluminum B-17. So at this point, they've stopped painting the B-17s with the olive drab camouflage paint because the Allies at this point have achieved air superiority. So what's the point of camouflaging your planes if you're looking around in the sky, there's a pretty damn good chance that that's an Allied plane.
Yeah.
So, followed by D-Day, we get into the summer of 1944. And I don't know this for sure. Sam and I talked about this a little bit. Um, Operation Frantic. Now, these are the shuttle missions to
Yeah.
Soviet airfields in Ukraine, and these were to bomb refineries and marshaling yards in Romania. And the reason we put this one in is because in some of the behind the scenes photos, you see the red tail P-51s for the 332nd. You see some P-40s of the 332nd, and then there was a Yugoslavian Spitfire,
Yeah.
and so
That's
we're
an odd
wondering,
one.
yeah, we're wondering if that has something to do with it. So we're not sure on that, but I went ahead and threw that in anyways because the
Yeah.
100th did indeed take part in some of the shuttle missions.
Mm.
So following that, I've got Battle of the Bulge on there because Battle of the Bulge, I can't remember. I think it was either as soon as the sky started to clear up, which is, God, it was either the day after or the day before Christmas in 1944, but that was another maximum effort.
Yeah.
And then after that, this mission I know for sure is in there. It's the Berlin raid of February 3rd, 1945. This is Rosenthal's 52nd and final mission, where he is shot down he's shot down about 40 miles away from Berlin, near the Oder River. He bails out and is picked up by Soviet troops. There's actually a part in the title sequence where you can see that he's holding his arm. And just a quick note, Rosenthal had broken his arm in September of 1944 when he had to make a crash landing in Belgium, I believe, behind friendly lines, and he broke his arm. Well, he fractured that same arm when he bailed out of his B-17 on February 3rd, 1945. So from there, then we would have Operation Chowhound, which is the food supply missions to the Netherlands. And that's kind of the expected mission list. Again, there's
Yeah.
probably some that aren't going to be shown, and then there's some that I didn't put on the list that will be shown. So again, that's kind of just what we expect to see. So we've already touched on the 100th Bomb Group. There's the 4 guys that we're going to follow. Those 4 guys, for the most part, and there's going to be lots of guys that we follow, but the 4 main characters that we'll be following are John Egan, played by Callum Turner, Buck Clevin, played by Austin Butler, Robert Rosenthal, played by Nate Mann, and Harry Crosby, played by Anthony Boyle. So let's go and talk real quick about the other unit that we're going to see, the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They flew with the 12th and then later the 15th Air Force. They were the racially segregated African American fighter unit who flew in the Mediterranean theater of operations. And I know a lot of people have been like, well, what's the connection there? Because they flew with the 15th and the 100th flew with the 8th. The whole storyline will be linked together at Stalag Luft 3 in Zogin, Poland, where captured Allied airmen were sent. So we're going to have pilots from the 100th, or pilots and crew of the 100th Bomb Group and pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group come together at that POW camp in Zogin, Poland. So there's your connection right
And
there.
for those of you who are wondering why you know the name Stalag Luft 3 and can't think of where you know it from, that's the camp from The Great Escape
Yeah.
that we all know and love.
Yeah. Okay, so I just took a look. They popped up the little amount of time left for the
I'm
Zoom
seeing that
meeting.
as well, yeah.
Okay, all right, just making sure. Okay. So the 2 pilots, as best I can tell from research, is we're going to be following Alex Jefferson, who's played by Brandon Cook, and then Robert Daniels, who's played by Shudi Gatwa. And both of these guys were shot down and captured. So we will see them at Stalag Luft 3. Apologies to our listeners, a quick editor's note. I did not find this out until after we had already recorded the podcast, but there is a 3rd Tuskegee Airman that the series will closely follow, and that is Lieutenant Richard D. Macon, played by Josiah Cross. And then we'll see them again on the march in 1945, where Hitler ordered Allied airmen to be moved from Poland into Germany to potentially use them as a bargaining chip in peace negotiations. So in January 1945, all those guys had to march from Poland to Moosburg, Germany, where Stalag 7A was held. And we're going to get a battle at that POW camp. You kind of see some clips of it in the trailers. But just a quick note, because I mentioned 12th and 15th Air Force, the P4, when the Tuskegee Airmen are flying the P40s, that means they were with the 12th Air Force, and then once they got the P51s, they transferred over to the 15th, where they started doing bomber escort missions. So those are, I think that's pretty much what we're expected to see in Masters of the Air. We just wanted to hit the highlights. There's a lot we didn't talk about. I mean, God, we're going to see things like, it still called the Blitz bombing in 1943 and 44 on England?
Sort of, yeah. And so the most of the raids stopped by about 1943, and then it moved on to the V1 and then V2 rockets in 44, 45.
Okay, yeah.
It was just a continuation, but basically just the bombing of Britain is sort of known as the Blitz.
Okay, gotcha. So, and we're definitely going to see civilians on both sides. So you've got the British civilians and then the Germans. You're definitely going to see the British civilians and
Yeah.
really pissed off German civilians. Because there's a couple shots there where you can see Allied airmen being marched through the streets and they're tussling with German civilians who literally had just been bombed by those guys. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode of the Air War podcast. And again, check us out on YouTube and Spotify by searching Pursuit Picks Media or the Air War podcast. And then Sam and I will be back on, hopefully, if all the timing works out, we will be back with 2 episodes on Saturday, January 27th, or it'll be no later than January 28th, Sunday, January
Hopefully.
28th. Yeah, because the series will be releasing 2 episodes on January 26th. So Sam and I are going to have a lot to go over.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited about that. I've got a composition notebook to, write some stuff out. I took Friday off. I'm going to watch both episodes multiple times and then we'll jump on here and talk about it. So anyways, thank you all for tuning into this episode of the Air War podcast, presented by Pursuit Picks Media. Thank you to Sam for joining me on this episode. I didn't have to
It's
fly
a pleasure.
solo. He's a great wingman to have. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
Yeah.